Joe Biden's central campaign promise this year will never happen, and no one is talking about it. Back in May 2022, when news first leaked that the Supreme Court intended to overturn Roe v. Wade, the landmark case that established the constitutional right to abortion, one word began to rocket to the top of Democrats' lexicon.
Codify.
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 Codify Roe.
Codify Roe.
I haven't said codify this much in my entire life.
Specifically, Democrats now promise, at nearly every opportunity, to codify the national right to abortion previously guaranteed by Roe v. Wade into federal law. Biden touts it on the trail.
Like the Democratic Congress, Kamala and I will make Roe v. Wade the law of the land again.
So does Kamala Harris.
When Congress passes a law that restores the reproductive freedoms of Roe, Joe Biden will sign it into law.
It's all over their ads.
I will fight like hell to get your freedom back.
And their social media. And that makes a lot of sense politically. Despite a small bump in polling for Biden in the spring, the presidential election is still a toss-up at best for him. And polls universally show that voters trust Trump more on most major issues. But one of the few issues Biden does lead on is abortion. And it's not even close. So in an election in which abortion is a central issue, and with wide majorities telling pollsters they support the principles of Roe v. Wade, running on codifying Roe is kind of a no-brainer, right? Except when you think about it for even more than a second, there's three massive hurdles that basically ensure it won't happen. First, the politics. In order to even get on the road to codifying Roe, Joe Biden would have to get a unified Democratic Congress, a task that requires not only flipping the House of Representatives, but keeping Democrats' Senate majority, which is historically difficult this year. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is retiring, so Republicans are starting with a guaranteed pickup of one Senate seat no matter what, putting the parties at 50-50. Because Democrats don't really have any realistic shot at flipping a Republican Senate seat this year, that means they can't afford to lose a single seat and have to do a complete clean sweep, holding open seats in Michigan and Arizona, and re-electing incumbents in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Nevada, all states that Biden won by 2.5 points or less in 2020 and is currently trailing or tied in, while also re-electing incumbent Democrats in the solid red states of Ohio and Montana. And it's worth emphasizing those last two. Trump won Ohio and Montana by 8 points and 16 points in 2020, and he's basically guaranteed to win them again. Now, historically, that wasn't a huge problem. A lot of senators used to win re-election even as their states voted for the other party for president. But recently, voters have become way less likely to split their ballots between the parties. Think about it this way. In 2004, when George Bush won re-election, 7 states split their Senate and presidential votes, voting for a Democrat for president and a Republican for Senate, or the other way around. In 2012, when Barack Obama won re-election, 6 states did. When Donald Trump ran for re-election in 2020, only 1 did. And that continued even into the 2022 midterms. Only 1 state elected a senator of a different party than who it voted for in 2020. So even if Biden were to win re-election, history and recent trends tell us that he would probably enter a second term with a Republican Senate, which would kill any chance of codification right then and there. But let's imagine for a second that Democrats do defy the odds and scrape into the next Congress with the narrowest of congressional majorities. That brings us to the second hurdle, Congress's legislative process. Under current Senate rules, the filibuster requires a bill like this to have 60 votes to pass. So all 50 Senate Democrats would need to sign on to both the underlying legislation and changing those Senate rules. With Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who were the only 2 Senate Democrats to vote against the 2022 effort to weaken the filibuster, both retiring this year, the filibuster part may well be possible. But history also tells us that politicians in both parties have sometimes voted wildly differently when laws, rather than messages, are on the line. Think about Senators John McCain, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski voting to repeal Obamacare in 2015 when they knew it would be vetoed, and then killing a repeal bill in 2017 when they knew it would be signed. Or several House Democrats backing an aggressive drug pricing reform bill in 2019 when they knew it would fail, and then killing the same proposal in 2021 when they knew it could pass. But let's imagine that Democrats do defy the odds and win a Senate majority, and they do universally agree on changing the filibuster. Then there's the problem of the bill itself. Democrats' preferred vehicle for codification is called the Women's Health Protection Act, and it actually guarantees a right to abortion broader than what existed until 2022. If you're wondering why that is, it's because the Supreme Court case that actually governed the country until that time was not Roe v. Wade, but Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which was decided in 1992. And there were some key differences between the cases. Roe originally allowed no bans until the third trimester, which is 28 weeks into pregnancy. Casey changed that to allow bans after fetal viability, which has happened as early as 21 weeks recently, but is generally considered 23 or 24 weeks. And Roe allowed basically no restrictions before 28 weeks, while Casey allowed many restrictions, some as early as conception, as long as they didn't impose an undue burden on the woman getting an abortion. Now, in a lot of cases, those distinctions don't matter a lot, especially because more than 90% of abortions in the US occur before 12 weeks, which is why a lot of people have never heard of them. But when it comes to a federal codification bill, they matter a lot, because the Women's Health Protection Act fuses Roe and Casey, banning basically all restrictions before viability. Put simply, that means if it passed, it would outlaw a lot of restrictions that the Supreme Court allowed from 1992 to 2022. For the bill's authors and major pro-choice groups, that's the point. That's a good thing, and you're certainly free to agree. The problem is, a majority of the Senate so far does not. While the vast majority of them backed the bill back in 2022, several Senate Democrats have previously backed restrictions that would be outlawed under this bill. And the only two self-identified pro-choice Senate Republicans already oppose it. So even if Democrats defy history and hold the Senate, even if they all agree to changing the filibuster, they would still need to resolve a fight over just what kind of bill to pass. A big, ambitious bill that goes beyond Casey could lose some votes from moderates, while any erosion to it could threaten progressive support. All, remember, with zero room for error in a 50-50 Senate. But let's imagine that Democrats do defy the odds and win a Senate majority. And they do all agree on changing the filibuster. And they do come to an agreement on what codification means. All of that pales in comparison to the final challenge, the Supreme Court. Any bill Biden would sign would be challenged in court within minutes, and probably be on a rocket to the Supreme Court. And once it gets there, there's just no getting around a simple fact. There is close to zero chance this court would actually uphold a law to codify Roe v. Wade. On some level, that might seem kind of obvious. How would the court that struck down Roe allow a Roe bill to become law? But it's really worth emphasizing why and how. Everything Congress passes actually has to have some expressed authority within the Constitution. And every bill cites the specific parts of the Constitution in which it finds its authority. Democrats' codification bill, the Women's Health Protection Act, cites two areas. One, the enforcement clause of the 14th Amendment. And two, Article 1's Interstate Commerce Clause, which is what Congress relies on to pass most economy-related laws. But here's the thing. First, the 14th Amendment part is entirely moot because the Supreme Court has already ruled that the 14th Amendment has no right to abortion. That was literally the entire point of the Dobbs decision. So on its face, that's already out the window, meaning any chance the court would uphold a codification law would come down to upholding it under the Commerce Clause. But Congress's authority under that part of the Constitution has been significantly restricted in recent decades, beginning in the 1990s, when a far less conservative court, one in which a majority still upheld the constitutional right to abortion, first began to narrow its interpretation. So a rational observer might ask, if the court has already ruled that the 14th Amendment confers no right to abortion, and if previous less conservative courts have severely restricted the Commerce Clause, why on earth would this 6-3 conservative court uphold a law that relies on those two parts of the Constitution? That question becomes even more glaring when you zoom out. For decades, the chief organizing principles of both the Republican Party and the conservative judicial groups that helped create the Supreme Court majority have been the elimination of the federal right to abortion and the restriction of federal economic regulation. The idea that this conservative supermajority, the culmination of decades of their work, would allow the restoration of a federal right to abortion, potentially one even more expansive than what existed before Dobbs, premised on an expansive definition of the Commerce Clause, is a little mind-boggling. But that's not something you hear much, because, unfortunately, many elected officials have made a habit of glossing over those details. Take the 2022 fight over the Respect for Marriage Act. Countless Democrats, including the literal head of the party, framed that bill as codifying marriage equality or codifying same-sex marriage. A lot of journalists, and even some Republicans, ran with that line. The problem is, the bill didn't do that. It repealed the Defense of Marriage Act, which, before it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013, federally defined marriage, for purposes like tax filing or Social Security, as being exclusively heterosexual. A significant and worthy achievement, but not one that recognized a federal right to same-sex marriage and required all states to recognize them, which is what the Supreme Court did in 2015. And the reason is pretty simple. Congress has no more authority over state marriage laws than it has authority over their DMV hours. There are just some things Congress can't do and only the Supreme Court can do. So this exaggeration of Congress's ability to codify things isn't exclusive to abortion. But it is new how central it is to a presidential election and a president's rationale for their second term. And a big part of how we've gotten here is that basically everyone in DC has an incentive to pretend. Democrats can rally unhappy voters by linking their electoral victories to something much more popular than themselves. Progressives can use the fact that it hasn't happened so far as evidence that mainstream Democrats don't actually care. And Republicans can rile up their base by framing their victory as the only thing preventing a federal takeover of abortion law. Everyone wins. Let's call it the beltway bluff, when everyone has an incentive to play along with a fantasy, so there's no incentive for a lot of journalists to point out the obvious. But this also gets to something bigger. Second terms can be a really weird thing for a president to ask the country for. Every incumbent president in modern history has faced the problem of not really having a clear idea of what their second term is actually for. George Bush won re-election mainly by campaigning on 9/11 and cultural conservatism, which gave him very little political capital when he tried to privatize Social Security and crashed and burned. Barack Obama won re-election basically by being the anti-Mitt Romney, then saw his entire second-term legislative agenda wither and die. Donald Trump didn't even bother writing a platform for his second term, and well, you know. So in that context, despite the fact that it collapses under basic scrutiny, Biden's promise that he would codify abortion rights makes sense. It's a clear plan of action, a popular promise, an easily digestible sense of what America could be for the next 4 years. Exactly what presidents running for re-election often struggle with. But reality doesn't exist in the space between both parties. We already live in a time of extreme disaffection, anger, and declining faith in government. Imagine what would happen if Americans actually did re-elect Biden on a Roe codification platform, only to watch it fail to come to pass. The president's political survival may well depend on continuing to claim he can restore Roe legislatively, but the rest of us don't have to pretend.